SwayamPrabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the course An Introduction to Disability Studies. Today we are going to talk about gender, body and sexuality, right, which means to say that lecture number 13 is dedicated to talk about women, to talk about what is a connection of a woman with the body and what disability studies has to say about women and body. And why is it so that this lecture is more dedicated or going to talk about gender, body and sexuality, right. So, what is sexuality has to do with the disability, what a gender has to do with sexuality and what these two connects, what these two talk about the discourse of disability. So, before we enter into this lecture, before we enter to talk about this connection or interconnection or interrelatedness of gender, body and sexuality, let us first talk about what we discussed in the previous lecture. In the previous lecture, we were talking about aesthetics and disability. We tried to explore that a sense of a perception is colored by a kind of a culture you belong to, right, which means to say that one particular culture has a different kind of aesthetic experience that may vary from one culture to another, which means to say that what looks good in one community may not look good to the another community. But there was an attempt made by colonizers where they wanted to put the very idea of a beauty universally applicable, where they made people to follow and comply with one ideal sense of a beauty. But as I have also been discussed that because of this idea of ideal sense, it is almost impossible that we can reach to that perfect norm or that perfect ideality of a body, right. Second important point that we made when we are talking about disability. The second point was that when aesthetic is being discussed in terms of representation or in terms of a body, it is generally understood as a more neutral, right. It has nothing to do with politics or morality. There was a sense of understanding that any kind of image that is being produced is more neutral image, right. It has nothing to do with the politics and morality. It is talking about is a beauty, what is has to do with morality or politics. But later on people started questioning the very notion of aestheticality of a body, and they started suggesting that this very projection of a image or of an ideal standard is a normative one, which means to say that people are politically motivated to appreciate a sense of a beauty which is oriented to promote a particular culture, and therefore they acknowledged that yes, there is a politics of homogenization or what I say hegemonization, right. So, this very idea of disinterestedness or opticality that concern the discourse of aesthetics is not true, is not relevant here, because the very politics of projection, right, this very representation is aesthetically motivated, which has to do with the politics, which means to say that what kind of a beauty you want to appreciate, which kind of a beauty you want to project, right. So, this is a very notion of idea of a beauty that we need to understand that it was universalized by colonizers, and today even the idea of a beauty is more ableist one, which means to say that it has been promoted by ableist notion, right, where there is the idea of a beauty which has to be more muscular one, and that is why in the previous lecture I showed to you that there are different images, how are they produced, how people wanted to produce only those sense of a beauty which appeal your emotions positively. What I mean to say that appealing your emotions positively is that they are the normative one, and people thought that only those images are acceptable in public spaces which meet the normative standard, right. But we also noticed that how the very idea of a disgust is deliberately attached with certain idea of a beauty, and which the very purpose of producing that kind of image as a disgusted image, so that people do not desire that kind of image, people do not desire that kind of a body, people do not assume that this body is going to be acceptable today or tomorrow, right. So, these are the important point that I was talking in the previous lecture. Now, when we are going to talk in this lecture about gender, body and sexuality, first thing is that why are we going to talk about gender, right. You may say that this is about more gender studies, why are we discussing it in disability studies? My contestation would be, and I am sure that by now you might have understood my argument and the point, that these images, these ideas or disability studies is more concerned towards minority identity. And I am sure that you will accept the very fact that gender has to do with minority. Since millennia, people have subjugated women in our patriarchal culture, right. Patriarchal is also the normative one. If you look at the history, you will realize, right. If you go back to the history, you will notice that women were considered as a disabled one. Don't you think that is a laughable idea, that women are considered to be a disabled one? Obviously, because so far we have understood, because we also talked about the discourse of ableism, that in relation to men, women were considered disabled. As I argue that disability is not a monolithic identity, or it is not a singular entity which exists aloof with everything. No, in relation to something it becomes disabled, right. And that is why I have been accusing the discourse of industrial capitalism, which constantly put pressures on the people to keep performing, otherwise they will be considered as a disabled, or keep working to adequate themselves into the normative standard. Otherwise, today they feel able, tomorrow if they do not perform in the same way, or they do not look like the same, the way it is assumed or respected by the industrial capitalism, they will be considered disabled, right. So, the argument what I am making is that in relation to men, muscular body, feminine body is considered to be disabled one, right. So, in a society where we live, in most of the society, I will not say equally everywhere that is applicable, in most of the society we see that muscular body is considered to be a perfect body, or people should desire that kind of a body. Feminine body is not what people desire. They do not expect that one has to be feminine, and that is why you see that the gym culture was extremely promoted in everyday's life. In every nook and corner, in every cities, even in the villages now you see there are gyms. There are gyms for the purpose that you can adequate, right, you can equate yourself with the very idea of muscularity. Your body should look muscular, you do not want to look feminine at all, because that would demean, that body will be demeaned in public spaces, and muscular body will be appreciated. Why is it so? Why is it so that muscular body is being appreciated and feminine body is being rejected? Because that is what the politics of industrial capitalism is, right. This is what is all idea of the aesthetics, that which kind of a body is being appealed, what kind of a body is projected as ideal beauty, what kind of a body is appreciated by people or majority or normative standard, right. That is a one notion about the gender. Now, coming to the another point is about sexuality. Let me make this very clear. How do you identify yourself as a sexual being, right? There are people who think that they are heterosexual, straight. There are people who consider themselves as a homosexual, gay, lesbian, right. There are people who consider themselves in a different form of sexual being. But as we all know, we are living in a heterosexual society. See, when I am talking about it, I am talking in my context, in my community's context. Because I have not traveled the entire world, I have not seen entire communities, I have not gone to talk anthropologically studied every culture. So, I won't say what I am saying is applicable to all culture and community. I am generally talking from my own culture or point of view perspectives, right. So, in India, most of cultures are heterosexual one, and due to the heterosexualities, homosexual people feel alienated or excluded. I am sure that if you look at the basic law and rights, still homosexual people had to look for certain rights which are denied to them. Recently, because of the Supreme Court judgment, at least they got some sense of privacy, right. But before that, it was not even the case, it was a offense, right. If you are indulging with a partner in sexual activity, it was considered to be an offense, you will be, it's a criminalized, but now Supreme Court has decriminalized. So, in heterosexual culture, homosexual people are feel disabled. So, a kind of a culture, what standard is promoted, what form of a culture has taken, and if you deviate from that norm, you will be considered disabled, as in fact, I have been talking about that anything that deviates from the norm considered to be a form of disability. I am saying this again, anything that deviates from the norm is considered to be a form of a disability, all right. So, homosexuality also becomes a form of disability in a heterosexual culture. That is a one point I make, that how sexuality is very much part of disability identity. Now, let me talk about the second important point, that why I am talking about sexuality. The second important discussion going to be is this, that disabled people are often considered asexual one or hypersexual, right. So, most of the time what happens, there is a general notion or representation or projection about people with disability as if they are hypersexual or they are asexual. Let me give you a case. Renu Adlakha, if I am remembering, no, I think Veena Das, not Renu Adlakha. Veena Das had made a study where she is talking about that in a Punjab, you can share a room with a disabled woman. What this idea talk about? That a person, a man can share a room in a hotel. I do not know exactly what hotel she was talking about, but in certain Punjab, in places of a Punjab, she is talking about certain hotels where you can share a room with a disabled woman. What this idea is talking about? This idea, it says that if you are sharing a room with a disabled woman because of two reasons, but first, disabled woman is asexual. So, there is absolutely it is not problematic, it is not problematic at all, because you cannot have a sexual relationship with a disabled woman, because disabled woman is asexual. Or the second thing is that the body of disability is not aesthetically appealing. So, therefore, you will not feel sexually oriented, right, towards a disabled woman. So, there is no problem in sharing a room. Now, obviously, one may say that what this stupid assumption is, but more than ridiculous or ludicrous proposition, it can be inferred, is that if you are sharing a room and both are consensually agreed to share, like make a sexual relationship, why someone else has to bother about it? Why someone outside has a problem with it? But let us not talk about that kind of a concern, because we are more talking about in relation to disability and sexuality. So, in relation to that, a disabled woman, it is generally a notion that they are considered to be asexual, and I just now told you a case about it. So, that is why I am talking about here that how disability connects with sexuality. And as you all know, that every man or women or whatever identity they belong to, they have a constitutional rights in terms of sexuality. But why is it so that the rights of sexuality, like people with disability are deprived of the sexual rights? Here I am going to talk about two arguments. The one important argument is that people generally feel and think that sexuality or sexual rights is something which can come later. There are other rights first they should talk or discuss or give it to first. So, there are right to education, there are right to employment. So, talk about these kind of right first, because disabled people need these rights than sexual rights. So, or they are talking about that, let them first get these rights and then they can have a sexual rights. My problem is that why sexual right is considered to be a secondary to other rights is obviously because the kind of a culture we live in, it is not given much importance or due importance as it deserves, right. That is a one contestation I am making. Second is that most of the time it is also noticed that people with disability are tabooed or considered morally corrupt if they demand to have a sexual rights. That is where extremely, like this is where one has to have a problem with it, right. If a normal people looks for a sexual right, it looks so good, nice, as if it is his right or it's nice, like there is no problem with it. But the moment a disabled woman or man demands for the rights, sexual rights, it is considered to be as a morally corrupt. The person is considered to be a morally corrupt. He is a tabooed, discriminated, ostracized, right. So, this is why we have these kind of discourses and concern, and until and unless we talk openly in academic and civic culture, and we create a kind of a culture academically or in terms of a civic culture, where these kind of discussion are normal, so called, where people have no problem with it, people can openly discuss and engage with these issues. So, until and unless we do so, what would happen that people with disability will be deprived of sexual rights. More than that, it will be considered as if it has nothing, like they have, why are they, like sexuality is not at all part of a discussion of disability discourse. But as I in the last lecture I was talking about Margaret Sheldrick, Janet Price and many more in fact have spoken voluminously about sexuality and disability. And trust me, if I go to the deeper extent, I will make this point that most of the time what happens, right, most of the time sexuality has a potentiality to challenge your anxiety, right. The normative construction feels threatened the moment disability and sexuality discourse come together. So, it has that kind of potentiality to challenge the normative discourse, and that is another reason we must and talk about it. So, before we talk about it, it is also important to look back, go back to the history and notice that what people have been talking and engaging with it, what people has to say about it. Was like in history, if you go, you will see that there are many thinkers or very great philosophers have never talked about disability and sexuality together. All right. So, with this kind of open introduction, I will go back to the slides and will speak one point after another, so that you can understand the connection of gender, body and sexuality in relation to disability. All right. So, let us go back to the slide number 1. Here you see the first slide is talking about that disabled people have often been represented as without gender, first point, asexual creatures, as freaks of a nature, monstrous, the other to the social norm. Right? If you recall, this is what I was talking about, that people with disability were considered as asexual creature, right? As if disabled people have no gender, right? It as if disability has a very different category, right? So, I always talked about and also gave you example that why people with disabilities are considered asexual creature, and also one point that it makes that they are considered as a without gender, and they are also considered as a freak nature, because people tend to think that their behavior can never be normal. So, anything that deviates from the norm, as I say, keep considered to be disability. So, it has nothing to do with the body itself. So, that is what it says, that other to the social norm, O with a capital O, other to the social norm. Okay? So, monstrosity aligns with disability. Like disabled people are monstrous people, that is what we see in our history. In our culture, we see that disabled people are seen as a monstrous being, as if they are not human at all. The monstrosity is the reason, right? Why do the people are considered or projected as a monstrous? Because normative culture think that they cannot be tamed as a nice or human civilized person, because disability can always challenges, threatens normative culture. So, anything, right, anything that challenges the normative adaptability will be considered monstrous, right. So, as you know that the very idea of civilization is based on repression, which means to say that how you will be called as a civilized being. You are a civilized being provided you follow certain set of behavior, you follow certain sense of code of conduct, and if you do not follow that, you are going to be tagged as disabled or monstrous. So, people with disability, because of the body they are in, they are considered that they can never be produced as a civilized being, because the very presence of them in physical or sorry in cultural space will keep threatening our civic culture. So, which is why let us label them as a monstrous. Let us consider them as a monstrous being, tag them, so that they are always feel uncomfortable in coming to the places, or they keep working to comply with normative culture. Right? This is and that is what I talk about violence, that how normative culture is producing a form of violence on people with disabilities. All right. Right. So, this is what the first point is talking about, and that you need to understand very critically. Here what I am also giving you a sense that you need to constantly think that how monstrosity is related to disability, right. How disability is considered other to the social norm, right. So, this is an important point for discussion in our disability studies discourse. So, my dear students and friends, our job is to engage with these issues critically, thematically, politically, to see that what kind of a culture we are in, where certain form of difference is considered as a monstrous, right. I mean, I do not want to take a very clear examples. Let us say for example, conjoined twins, how a particular society receive conjoined twins, right. Think about it. It is conjoined twins produces a kind of anxiety which constantly threaten normative culture, and that is why medically conjoined twins are either separated or killed, right. This is a part of another discussion which hopefully I will highlight in some other lectures. But because I was talking about body, gender and sexuality, I thought let us touch upon it, right. Let us talk about it. All right, let us go back to the slide number, point number 2 in the slide 1. Over 15% of the global population grapples with disabilities spanning physical and sensory impairments, developmental and intellectual challenges and psychosocial conditions, right. So, this is basically talking about that 15% of people are disabled people. Obviously, I have already talked about the politics behind the kind of a census is conducted, because in the villages most of the time people do not want to talk that their children are disabled, right. And also the kind of a question you frame in the census, how do you identify, right. That is my first very interesting question I ask people or students, that why do you think I am not a disabled one, right. How do you look at me and consider that I am not disabled, right. So, this is why I am just giving you a statistic data that is available on the website, which says that 15% of the global population is considered disabled. But trust me, there are more. In fact, there are many people are disabled because they deviate from the norm. It depends how do you define disability, how do you think about disability. This 15% population is just about that if you do not have limbs or if you do not have eyes or ear or something else. It is not talking about that deviation from the norm, or people who deviate from the norm are considered to be disabled because they share the same experience as people with disability do in our society. All right. So, this is a second point that is made by the slides. So, obviously, what this question, what I am proposing for you, that think about the way we are defining disability, think about the way disability is defined in different societies, and also think about that how in a different culture disability definition evolves, right. How in one society is different and second society is different, or in the same like after 10 or 20 years how definition of disability change its meaning, how the meaning associated with body changed itself. So, these are the questions that you need to engage with. All right. Let us go back and see the point number 3 of the slide. First, Western thought has historically intervened femaleness and disability, viewing both as a deviation from an ideal standard, right. This is what I was talking about, that female deviate from the norm, and that is why they are considered disabled. Okay. So, here you see this is a very interesting point is making, it is made that Western thought has historically intervened femaleness and disability, viewing both as a deviation from an ideal standard. I am sure that you all have read the name of Aristotle, right. You all are very much familiar with Aristotle. Aristotle described women as a mutilated males, suggesting that women were deficient versions of a man, right, deficient versions of a man. So, according to Aristotle, women possessed improper form, right. Women possessed improper form and considered monstrosities. Right. So, here you see when Aristotle is talking about men are considered to be a form of a normative structure. Men are norm. Anything that deviates from the men will not get dignity or proper respect as men receive in a particular society, because you deviate. So, female form is deviating from men. So, they are called mutilated males. Look at this, mutilated has connection with disability, right. Women were thought or interpreted as a mutilated males, like mutilated males is equal to women. So, mutilated males have less respect as male have. So, obviously, female who are considered to be mutilated males will not get the same respect and rights the way male get, right. So, that is what it is saying, that women were considered monstrosities because they are deviating from the norm. And look at this, this is the statement made by Aristotle. Look back and see at what time. Aristotle is not from today's, it is not from 200 or 300 years before. Look at the time when already people are talking about disability, femaleness or monstrosity or male, and how there is a deviation from the norm and who has right to do what, which one is desirable, which one is more acceptable, what is expected from you, what is not expected from you. This is not a new phenomena. By giving Aristotle quote, I am just trying to tell you that this is not a new phenomena. And that is why I am also asking you to look at it, that how it changes and evolves. Right? The very idea of a femaleness has been defined and redefined as society proceeds. All right. So, keep this in mind and let us go back to the point number 3rd. In contemporary feminist discourse, scholars have contended that being female in a patriarchal society can be akin to having a disability, right. That is the point I am making. Iris Marion Young, a beautiful female, beautiful philosophical thinker, like Marion Young, explores how societal expectations of feminine behavior constrain women's ability to express themselves physically, limiting them to activities deemed appropriate for girls, right. This is a very powerful statement made by Iris Marion Young. How societal expectations of feminine behavior constrain women's ability to express themselves physically and limiting them to activities deemed appropriate for girls, right. What is this very idea of appropriation? Right. What is this idea of appropriation? The idea of appropriation is that it is not what you want to do, it is more that what is expected from you what to do. Think about this, right. So, a woman, however potential she is being limited by social convention to perform her best behavior or her best talent or best skill, because there is a pressure from the social convention that you need to only do this. Appropriate, what is appropriate for you? That is what appropriation does. Something that appropriates for girls or something that is appropriate for you, you are supposed to do that, not what you want to do that. There is a possibility that you can go beyond what is expected from you. There is a huge opportunities you can explore, but no, you are not expected that you can be a good swimmer. It is not expected that you be a good warrior, because that is not appropriate for girls. And what Iris Marion Young is saying, that societal expectations of feminine behavior, right, you are not going to do something that aligns with the masculine behavior. So, I am not saying that every woman must try to perform masculinity, but I am suggesting that how the potentiality of a woman is limited because of the appropriation, because of the social convention, how it limits the strength and possibilities for women, right. So, this is what appropriation is all about. Appropriation, approbation, these are two important argument in post-colonial studies, right. So, in disability studies also, we also touch upon this kind of argument, that how we look at appropriation of women with disabilities or women, or let us say for example, people with disabilities, all right. So, think for this, it is an extremely significant argument. Look at the second argument that Iris Marion Young is making. Look at your slide please. In the slide if you see, she argues that in a sexist culture, right, in sexist, and I would say something more, patriarchal, just a second please, here you see the spelling, patriarchal, right, sexist culture, women's capacity for embodied agency is restricted, leading to what she terms as a form of a physical handicap. Look at this, the very powerful claim made by disability scholar, right. Women in a sexist society face limitations akin to those experienced by individuals with physical disabilities, right. So, women are considered as a handicap because they are not men. Their agency is restricted. They are considered, their body, the female body is considered to be a form of a physical handicap. Now, you see how gender studies and disability studies come together, because gender studies has constantly ignored the argument of disability studies. But later on, like there are many women, there are many scholars, they came in the front and they started talking about gender studies and disability studies together. So, because Iris Marion Young as a philosopher is making this claim that women with disabilities, or let us say sorry, women are a physical handicapped women, physically handicapped, right. So, here you see that just because they are not men, they are considered to be as a handicap. It is not that being handicapped is something wrong, but because as I say that if you want to discriminate someone, discrimination will be justified if you attach with the disability. You remember the last lecture where I was talking about disqualification becomes easier if some way or other way someone is able to prove that it has something to do with the disability. You want to reject a body, some way or other way prove that it has something to do with disability, right. So, I am not saying that being handicapped is something bad, right, but what I am suggesting here that you look at the position of disability in a society. Women are being discriminated because they are being proven as if they are physically handicapped, and then obviously disabled people are discriminated. So, it becomes easier once you prove this that these women are also physically handicapped. That is the argument. The argument I am not only making about gender and disability, I am also going to say that what is the condition of a people with disability, right. It is a considered like it is an important point to think that women proven as a disabled, it becomes easier to discriminate them or disqualify them from the society, right. You can hold on here for a second and think about this important argument that I am making for you, right. So, let us go to the slide number 2. The systems of gender, race and ability are deeply intertwined, often depicting marginalized individual as more bodies devoid of intellectual or spiritual qualities. Look at this, right. The system of a gender, race and ability are deeply intertwined, often depicting marginalized people as mere bodies devoid of intellectual or spiritual qualities. Like, I mean, I have been talking about this, right? I have been discussing this, that the moment they see that you are a disabled one, they think that you are morally corrupt. They think that, oh, you cannot like progress yourself as a spiritual person. It's not, society will not expect anything from you. You are nowhere to be thought as if something good be done from your side, right. So, divide, like the moment it is seen that you are disabled, so divide of intellectual capabilities or spiritual qualities. Look at important point that is being made, in a strong vehement point I am making, so that you can see how strongly people with disability are repulsed, right. Look at this statement. This embodiment is frequently framed as either deficient or excessive. For instance, women have historically been portrayed as lacking, described as castrated, right. You saw in the first lecture, so the first slide, mutilated. Now, what do you see? Castrated. See that? Two things. This embodiment is frequently framed as either deficient or excessive, right. You remember, I have been talking about either hyper or asexual, right, not so called normal, right, either extreme form or very less forms, right. So, women have been historically been portrayed as lacking, described as castrated, or what Marguerite Marge Piercy says, penis poor, right. So, they have been labeled as historically, sorry, they have been labeled as hysterical or as having imbalanced hormones. So, at different points in history, women have been depicted as possessing insatiable appetites or as a pathologically self-denying. Similarly, disabled individuals have been subject to such a binary representation. They have been portrayed as having extra chromosomes or limb deficiencies, with their differences framed as either atrophy indicating degeneration or hypertrophy suggesting enlargement. So, description of disability often use term like aplasia indicating absence or failure of formation, or hypoplasia suggesting underdevelopment. While it is evident that people with disabilities possess equal right to sexual and reproductive desires and aspirations compared to their non-disabled counterparts, societal attitudes often dismiss their sexuality and reproductive rights. So, if you see these slides, you must have noticed that how they are proved as a biologically unfit, right. How women are projected or reproduced as if there is something wrong with their body, right. There are a lot of medical terms have been used to define women, because it becomes so easy if you produce something connection with medical discourse, right. If you say that someone is suffering from so and so, the talk is over. They should go to the medical institution. Society is not responsible for that, right. In fact, it has often seen in society that society immediately takes off its responsibility the moment it is proven that it is a medical subject, not a social subject, it is a medical subject. So, here also you see interestingly what is happening, that women are produced or reproduced as a medical subject, which means to say that if society is doing something wrong, like let us say for example, if you are suffering from fever, if you have influenza, or if you have some medical disease, principal has right to ask you to take a leave, because they may say that it is being contagious, other students are also being infected, may be infected, right. The future possibility that it may not happen to our hygienic society, you are being a threat to our society, you are being a danger to our society. So, therefore, the moment it is proven that you have become part of a medical subject, anything can be done with you, discriminated, ostracized, not allowed to work, not allowed to live properly, right. You cannot access public spaces, right. You can be confined to a private rooms or maybe hospitalized, or people will treat you as if you are not worthy of living in a healthy society. You should not meet friends, you should not talk. So, what I am talking about that the moment it is being said that you are a medical subject, the talk is over. Society is not responsible for anything wrong happened to you, right. Even in the legal discourse, I do not want to get into that, but even in the legal discourse, if it is proven that like you are mentally unfit or something, then people may say that okay, this is something good or bad, whatever, right, according to the context in which we are talking about. So, this is an important idea. You see how medical help or discourse of medical comes into the picture to produce a healthy, hygienic, good society, right. In fact, I would suggest here that you must read a book by Michel Foucault called Dangerous Individuals. That is a wonderful book, and that is where it talks about that how even criminality comes into the picture. I will not go into details, but I request you that you please read that book. It is a really helpful and suggestive one. Okay? So, let us go back to the slides and look at the next slide. People with disability, I have been talking and explaining to you this in my introductory lecture, that people with disability frequently encounter infantilization and stereotyping, being perceived as either asexual or hypersexual, deemed incapable of reproduction and labeled as unsuitable partners or parents. Right. Here you see that if it is proven that you are medically unfit, if it is proven that you are asexual or hypersexual, even the right to become a parent is taken away from you. Right. That is an important idea. Look at the second point. The sexual and reproductive health and rights of people with disabilities remain contentious, with particular emphasis on challenges faced by women in this regard. So, for women, disability often translates into exclusion from traditional notion of femininity, partnership and active sexuality, as well as the denial of opportunities for motherhood. So, these issues underscore the urgent need for greater awareness and advocacy to ensure the fulfillment of sexual and reproductive rights for individuals with disability, particularly women. Now, that there is a question, how do people with disabilities perceive, experience and express their sexuality? How do people with disabilities perceive, experience and express their sexuality? So, this is the question. There is a possibility that I may not give you an answer, but I am generally expecting you to examine and explore these questions. I have already hinted to this. So, beyond the specific challenges posed by their disability, these experiences are shaped by complex interplay of cultural, social, economic and gender factors. Factors such as poverty, stigma, discrimination, societal norms contribute to shaping feeling of a safe sexual desire, confidence and self-worth. So, here you see in this slide what I am talking about is that how even the right of being mother is being snatched. You are being deprived of being a mother, right. The motherhood experience, you cannot have this experience if it is proven that you are biologically or medically unfit. Obviously, saying something medically unfit has a cultural connotations, and it also where does it come from. So, therefore, what I am talking about, there are certain challenges which people do not even look at it, that how the body is being affected by the poverty, how the body is being affected by the economic conditions, what kind of a shame he is experiencing, whether he is able to feel confident in a society where he is living in, right. So, these are the ideas they come together to talk about disability and sexualities, right. Let us go back to the slide again. In many cultures, the enjoyment of sexual intimacy is both condemned and suppressed. Moreover, aside from legally recognized acts such as rape and molestation, the violence associated with normative sexual experience and absence of acknowledged sexual relationship often remains shrouded in silence. So, while there is some documentation of sexual violence against people with disabilities and human rights violation in this realm are acknowledged, in-depth analysis of individual context and gender sexual dynamics remains limited. So, here this is what I am making a point for your research, right. Even if you come from the discipline of anthropology and sociology, these are the important questions that you need to question, you need to explore. So, using this issue as a starting point, we must explore how people with like individuals whose sexuality is often perceived as either non-existent or hypersexual navigate and construct their sexual identities. So, sexuality is a basic human need. Awareness and knowledge about sexuality are shaped through a range of contextually specific socio-cultural and religious ideas and practices. So, people with disabilities are systematically denied access to knowledge about sexuality, sexual behavior and services leading to their sexual marginalization. So, feminist disability theory expands its examination beyond the normalization of bodies and medicalization of appearance to also question prevalent belief about reproductive rights, right. So, there are a social pressure to eradicate difference in physical form, right. Look at this slide, what it is saying. It has influenced reproductive practices such as genetic testing and selective abortion. So, certain disability advocates contend that decision to abort fetuses with disability, which is framed as a choice, is actually a coercive act tantamount to genocide against the disabled, right. Even today in a society, if you see that like people, if they tend to see that their children or their child is going to be disabled one, they do not like to have that, and they make a choice to remove that fetus, right. And that is what disability studies scholars are claiming, that it should be treated as a coercive act tantamount to genocide, right. But most of the time, as I talk about, this is not desirable, right. That kind of a body is not desirable, that kind of child is not desirable. So, on the basis of a norm, there is a law also framed, right. So, in fact, in some other lecture I am going to talk about norms and law, maybe not in this course, but if I frame other courses I will talk about it, right, because that is a very important discussion, that how law connects with norm, how legal policies are most of the times framed on the norms, right. So, think about this idea. So, talk about it. I will go to the next point. Look at the slide, please. Feminist theory has long scrutinized and the concept of womanhood, upon which much of feminist discourse traditionally relied. Increasingly, feminism acknowledges that a woman's identity is multifaceted, as she occupies various subject positions and is ascribed multiple cultural identity labels. This nuanced understanding of womanhood has prompted feminist theory to shift away from a narrow focus on male-female binaries and towards a more critical examination of the exclusionary, essentialist and oppressive aspect inherent in the category of women itself. So, disability serve as one such factor that complicates the unity of the classification of women and challenges the assumption of a gender as a singular homogeneous category. Disabled women constitute a distinct and often marginalized subgroups within the broader category of women characterized by diverse experiences. Disabled women frequently encounter barriers in accessing the privileges associated with conventional femininity. All right. So, these are the idea which I am framing, because what you need to do is like think about that how disability intervenes, how disability talks about gender, and what about the women with disabilities, right? Even a woman is not able to get the proper positions and rights in our society. What about women with disabilities? Even the reproductive rights and the health, even the idea of a motherhood, the experience of having a baby is denied to them. What would be the case with women with disabilities, right? I will leave you with this question and I will go to the slide first. Look at the slide please. Cultural stereotypes portray disabled women as lacking sexuality, right? Like they are constantly produced as if they do not have sexual right, like I was talking about, right? In a Punjab, disabled women, I am talking about some era before, some century, like some decades before, that they were considered asexual. Look at the slide please again. Reproductive capability and independence often rendering them as a peripheral to conventional notions of womanhood and beauty. Consequently, disabled women often face challenges in asserting their sexual autonomy and reproductive rights. Disability simultaneously amplifies and diminishes societal expectations of femininity. Aging is viewed as a form of disablement that marginalizes older women, denying them the social currency afforded to younger, more conventionally attractive women. So, additionally, certain psychophysical disabilities such as depression, anorexia, agoraphobia, which disproportionately affect women, reinforce normative gender roles, right. So, traditional feminine practices like foot binding, clitorectomies, corseting, along with contemporary equivalents like wearing stiletto heels, girdles, chastity belts, impose physical constraint on women's bodies, constraining their agency and effectively imposing disability upon them, right. So, here I am talking about that how social convention keep forcing them to behave as a woman or the mutilated male. All right. So, there is a lot to talk about this, but I would leave this to you to question, to engage with these discourses, right. So, with this I would like to end this lecture here, but before I end I would just make one request to you that please engage with these discourses so that we can more talk about, we can more discuss and we can promote the discourse of inclusion, or we can make a social space which promotes inclusivity. All right. So, with this I would end the lecture and see you next time in the lecture number 14, where I will be continuing another discourse further enhancing disability studies discipline. See you next time. Take care. Bye bye. Have a nice time. Stay safe and healthy.